Chapter 1. What the hell is that? First Lieutenant Walter Thomas thought this as he adjusted the binoculars to focus on the little town below. He studied the object in question for a long moment, trying to decide if the thing was truly unusual or if the darkness was merely playing tricks on his eyes. Finally, after conceding he just couldn't tell which, he quietly reached over to nudge the man stretched out beside him. Both men were lying prone on a hill just above a small German village, trying their best to blend in with the surrounding field of tall, damp grass. Both wore the olive-drab fatigues of the U.S. Army, with thick canvas field jackets to ward off the pre-dawn chill. The subdued insignia patches on their arms showed two capital A's, signifying they belonged to the 82nd Airborne Division. On the sides of their steel pot helmets were stenciled a black jack of diamonds, which identified them as being part of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment. Both were young, barely in their 20s, but with a week's worth of stubble on their chins and the stresses of combat on their faces, they appeared much older. The other soldier, a dark-haired sergeant named Curtis Maxwell, was busy flicking away some repulsive insect that had the gall to crawl across his forearm. A native of Brooklyn, he despised everything about the countryside: the annoying bugs, the dirty animals, the thorny underbrush, and perhaps most of all, the horrible smells. He couldn't wait to get back to civilization, to real cities of tall buildings, paved streets, and concrete sidewalks. Nevertheless, seeing his lieutenant offering him the binoculars, he quietly took them and dutifully began to scan the town. There wasn't much to the place. Even by small-town standards, this one was pretty puny. A single main road ran between a smattering of generic brick buildings that included a train station, a cafe, a few offices, and a general store. All were dark and quiet, however, with no lights in the windows and no movement on the streets. In fact, the place looked completely deserted. So far, the only life they'd even seen was an orange tabby cat that scoured the garbage cans in search of a morning meal. After a few moments, Curtis shrugged. "It's a ghost town, Lieutenant," he whispered. "Over there," Walter said, nodding. "The church." Curtis looked to the end of town, where the trimmed grass lawns gave way to barbed wire cattle pastures. Sitting alone on a small plot of ground was an old stone church, complete with arched stained glass windows and a large protruding bell tower. To Curtis, it seemed no more remarkable than any of the other hundreds of churches they'd seen during their march east across Europe. He scanned it for a few minutes before dismissing it with a shake of his head. "I don't see nothing, LT," he said in his thick Brooklyn accent. "They probably all hightailed it once they heard we was coming. The brass is just wasting our time with this one." Walter was inclined to agree, both that the place seemed abandoned and that the brass was wasting their time. But it wasn't people that had caught his eye just now. It was the electrical cables. At the rear of the church stood a tall utility pole with two large transformers mounted on outstretched wooden beams. From these hung thick metal lines that dipped down and ran into the rear of the building. "The power lines," Walter said, pointing. "In the back." Curtis lifted the binoculars to look again and was immediately puzzled when he saw what Walter was talking about. Power lines weren't unusual, since much of Europe now had electricity, but it was the size of the things that was curious. They were much thicker than normal, obviously built for heavier loads. "Huh," Curtis grunted. "What you suppose God needs that much juice for?" Walter only shook his head. The obvious answer was that he wouldn't. Now satisfied that his most trusted NCO also found the sight strange, Walter took back the binoculars and gave the town another scan. By comparison, all the other buildings had standard lines, which again begged him to question why the church would be so different. "Should we go down and take a closer look?" Curtis asked. Walter considered it, though in truth he was still stymied as to why they'd been sidetracked to such a seemingly insignificant little town in the first place. Why waste their time here when they should be joining in the march toward Berlin? God knew he and everyone else was ready to just get this whole damn war over with and go home. It had been a long and brutal 2 years for Walter and his men. Like many young American males, they had heeded the call to arms following Pearl Harbor. Upon completing the rigorous paratrooper training in Toccoa, Georgia, they sailed from New York across the Atlantic, where they managed to avoid being sunk by German U-boats, until they landed in Casablanca. After more training in northern Africa, they were baptized by fire with their first mission, a dangerous nighttime jump in an effort to take Sicily. They managed to win the island and were immediately ordered to join in an assault on the mainland at Salerno, another nighttime drop, another hard-fought victory. Now combat veterans, the 505th was sent to Ireland in preparation for their ultimate challenge. On June 6, 1944, a date the world would later come to know as D-Day, Walter and 13,000 of his brethren made the pre-dawn jump into northern France for the impending Allied invasion. Barely made the jump anyway. Their C-47 had been so battered around by flak bursts and anti-aircraft fire that the terrified pilots had wandered off their flight plans. Instead of jumping over the drop zone, Walter's stick wound up scattered all over the countryside like falling candy from a clobbered piñata. Not only had Walter been separated from his men, but he had the severe misfortune of parachuting into a grove of oak trees, where he was batted around like a baseball during batting practice at Yankee Stadium until he blacked out. He awoke in horror to find some German soldiers from the nearby town had assembled a small greeting party and were taking potshots at him as he dangled helplessly. Only by the grace of God had he been spared, when some local French resistance fighters showed up to join the party. The Germans quickly figured out they were surrounded and abruptly retreated. Had those fine young men not arrived when they had, Walter would have certainly been one of the first American casualties of war in France, hanging dead in a tree before his boots ever even touched the ground. Being spared, however, he was eventually able to regroup with his scattered men and continue on with their missions. These had been absolutely critical for the Allied expeditionary forces to establish a firm foothold on the coast and begin bringing men and machines ashore. From there, Walter's unit went on to spend the next several months fighting like hell to help push the German army back across the map. With Russia doing the same on the Eastern Front, it was now just a matter of who would reach Berlin first and finally put an end to the cursed war. Instead of marching on the capital city, however, they were here, scouting a seemingly abandoned town and trying to figure out why. That was when Walter saw the tiny red ember flare up in the steeple. It was dim and lasted only a brief second, but he knew in an instant what it was. Someone had taken a drag on a cigarette in the dark. Apparently, the town was not so deserted after all. He knew plenty of priests smoked, but surely not so early in the morning, and definitely not up in the steeple. The ember flared again before a silhouetted form leaned forward from the shadows to flick the butt over the railing, sending it streaking through the air like a tiny comet. As the figure briefly entered the moonlight, Walter immediately recognized it for what it was. It was a German soldier. Walter quietly nudged Curtis again and pointed to the steeple as he handed him the binoculars. Curtis adjusted the focus and stared a moment. "I'll be damned," he whispered. "A sniper?" Walter shook his head no. "A lookout." The two men lay watching for several minutes until a door to one of the brick buildings on Main Street suddenly opened spilling a dull yellow light out onto the ground. Walter snatched the binoculars back and watched as 2 German soldiers stepped out, followed closely by 2 men in dark suits and ties. The first was an older man, tall and skinny, with meticulously combed hair and wearing bifocal glasses. The other was a portly man with a thick mustache, who wore a heavy coat and carried a large briefcase. Both casually exchanged a few words, and neither appeared too alarmed to be under armed guard. In Walter's mind, this begged the question of whether the soldiers were there to contain the men or protect them. He received his answer when the escorts took the lead and the 2 men in suits followed. Obviously, they were of some importance. Walter watched, intrigued, as the group passed every building in town until they finally arrived at the front stoop to the church. The 2 soldiers opened the double doors and ushered the men inside. Once everyone had entered, they quickly shut them, and the street was once again quiet and dark. "Those didn't look like no priests to me," observed Curtis, echoing Walter's sentiments. "What you suppose the Jerry's got going on here?" "I don't know," Walter said, lowering the binoculars. He considered the situation a moment before adding, "Let's find out." Walter fastened the chin strap of his helmet and grabbed his rifle from where it lay in the grass beside him. Then he reached up with his right hand and gave signals over his shoulders. Enemy spotted. Move forward. Behind him, 20 camouflaged forms materialized from where they'd been hiding in the tall grass, then stealthily began making their way down the hill. The first shot came from Curtis, the explosion shattering the quiet of the morning and sending a few roosted birds into startled flight. The German sentry in the steeple, undoubtedly bored, careless, or likely just dreaming of another cigarette, had spotted the Americans much too late as they emerged from a line of brush several yards away. He was about to sound the alarm when Curtis's shot hit its mark, driving deep into his forehead as though it were no more than a ripe melon. His limp body fell forward over the railing, bounced off the inclined roof below, and landed with a thud on the ground at the feet of the approaching paratroopers. Walter's men instinctively took up flanking positions, some covering the rear of the church, while others covered the wooden double doors at the front. After 2 years of working together, they were a well-oiled machine. They knew the shot would bring others, and they would be in position for whoever came. A moment later, one of the front doors opened, and a German sergeant leaned out to investigate. Clearly, he had not anticipated seeing a squad of American paratroopers descending upon him, and he frantically tried to shut the door while simultaneously unslinging his submachine gun. He was too late for either action. The 2 soldiers on point opened up with their M1 Garens and sent a round apiece burrowing into his chest. He staggered backwards and collapsed on the floor, a large pool of blood rapidly forming beneath him. Walter sprinted forward and motioned for his men to follow. Never one to lead from the rear, he was the first one to charge up the stairs and burst through the doors. The entrance led into a large sanctuary with an open cathedral ceiling held aloft by thick oak support beams. A single carpeted aisle ran toward the pulpit, with rows of wooden pews on either side. Brass candelabras and brightly colored tapestries lined the dark stone walls, and a life-size statue of a crucified Jesus hung over the altar. Near the back of the church was a transept, with a confessional to the left and an antechamber to the right. It was from this opening that 6 German soldiers rushed out. Upon seeing the enemy in their midst, they promptly began shouting and firing their submachine guns. Their bullets sprayed everywhere, prompting the Americans to drop and return fire from behind whatever cover they could find. The destruction was quick and amazing. A cacophony of exploding firearms, splintering wood, shattering glass, and the pings of ricocheting bullets bouncing off stone and metal. Debris, shell casings, and contorted lead and copper rained down as the men fired hundreds of rounds at each other. All around were the sharp cracks and dull thuds of bullets striking whatever object happened to be in their path, an unsettling noise that Walter had always dreaded, knowing that at any second one of those flying projectiles could just as easily bury itself into his flesh with the same ferocity. Above the altar, the crucified Christ looked down over the melee until a few stray bullets shattered portions of its plaster into dusty divots. "Hey, you sacrilegious bastards!" Curtis shouted above the din. "Stop shooting Jesus!" The skirmish lasted only a few moments until the Germans' fully automatic weapons quickly expended their ammunition. As their operators struggled to reload, the Americans began to deliver some well-placed shots, a discipline that had been drilled into them on the firing range at boot camp. Better to get off one good shot than 100 bad ones. One by one, the Germans began to fall. As they did, the firing gradually began to subside until it finally stopped altogether. Walter had taken cover behind a wooden pillar, which was now splintered and pockmarked from several bullet strikes, and cautiously peeked around the side to make sure the fight was truly over. The smell of cordite, wood, and blood hung thick in the smoky air, and he could actually taste it as he panted for breath. His ears were ringing, and his eyes were stinging, but his first thoughts were only of his men. "Anyone hit?" he called out. A few called back to say that they were. One of them had taken a round in his left calf, which was bleeding a large, dark circle through his pants as he grabbed it and applied pressure. Another had been shot in the right forearm and was already holding a package of gauze in his good hand while trying to rip it open with his teeth. Still another man had been grazed through the fatty tissue of his abdomen, and as he cradled it, he joked through gritted teeth about how he'd been meaning to lose some weight anyway. That made Walter grin. All his boys were as tough as steel, and sometimes he pitied the soldiers who dared come up against them. The luckiest man by far had been Curtis, who'd been spared a headshot. He held up his helmet for all to see, and they were utterly amazed by the small, fresh dent in the front. "You see this?" he asked in astonishment. "You see this?" He repeated the question until every man was forced to nod, smile, and congratulate him on his outstanding luck. Walter nodded also and clapped him on the back for his good fortune. It was a rare thing indeed on the battlefield. Walter looked around at the rest of his men until he was satisfied everyone was okay. There were only 3 minor casualties and no fatalities. Everyone was bleeding from minor cuts or other superficial wounds, but nothing that seemed to be life-threatening, a minor miracle, considering they'd all just been in an enclosed room where 100 projectiles had been zipping and bouncing around at over 1,000 feet per second. Walter then motioned for a squad to clear the rest of the building and check for any stragglers. The remaining men, those who weren't busy applying bandages or pouring sulfa powder into wounds, immediately began to check the fallen Germans to make sure they were actually dead. They were, their warm blood pooling on the cold stone floor as their unblinking eyes stared out into eternity. Some of the paratroopers began to search them for souvenirs, seeing if the dead men had anything that wasn't already in their burgeoning collection of knives, pistols, patches, caps, or uniform brass. Walter, meanwhile, spent his time carefully examining the bodies, trying to figure out who they were and get an idea of why they were there. All wore the dark gray uniforms of the Wehrmacht Heer, the regular German army, and were a mixture of both younger and older men. Almost all had been carrying MP-40 submachine guns, small-caliber weapons designed primarily for close urban combat. They all had the same insignia, and although Walter didn't recognize the design, it told him they'd been a single cohesive unit, a guard detail perhaps. If so, what the hell were they doing here? Walter looked around the church again, wondering why the soldiers had chosen such an odd place to hide out, and what had happened to the 2 civilians they'd been escorting, and what of the thick electrical cables outside. Aside from a few hanging light bulbs, he didn't see anything else that would even require electricity. He continued to scan the interior, certain he was missing something, but only seemed to notice more and more little details that told him things here weren't what they seemed. Before his mind could piece together a definitive answer, however, his thoughts were broken by Curtis calling excitedly from across the room. "Hey, fellas!" Curtis yelled. "We got us someone who likes to play hide-and-seek!" Walter turned in time to see Curtis drag a German soldier by the lapels of his jacket from an antechamber. He quickly shoved the man into a seated position on the floor and began to search him. Walter and a few others stepped over to gather around and gawk at the new arrival. He was an older man with salt and pepper hair, a tad overweight but well-groomed and clean-shaven. His uniform was that of an officer, and aside from some fresh blood from a minor wound in his shoulder, was otherwise meticulous. Walter guessed he was some kind of desk jockey, one who had likely spent the majority of the war well away from the front lines. A quick scan of his rank identified him as a colonel, which was a surprise. Quite a high rank for such a small group of men. So, what was he doing here? What were any of them doing here? Seeing that Walter was the only officer there, the colonel looked up to meet his gaze. His hazel eyes were cold and hard with contempt. Walter slowly removed his helmet and bent down to take a knee beside him. "Guten Tag, Herr Oberst," Walter offered, the extent of his German. His attempt at being cordial did not have the desired effect, however, and the other man only looked away, clearly uninterested in engaging in any sort of dialogue. Walter sighed. So much for getting any easy answers. Curtis, who was still searching his prisoner, located a leather billfold in an inside jacket pocket. He started to pull it out when the colonel suddenly grabbed his wrist. Several gun barrels immediately appeared, all pointed directly at his head. He wisely reconsidered his actions, slowly releasing his grip and lowering his hand. Curtis grinned, the dangerous look on his face suggesting that he would have rather enjoyed teaching the man a thing or two about prisoner-of-war etiquette. He pulled the wallet out, only to find it affixed to the inner lining by a small brass chain. Using his free hand, he slowly withdrew a large dagger. As he brought it menacingly close to the colonel's face, the man appeared surprised to see it was German-made, with a white swastika inlay on the black hilt. "You like it?" Curtis smirked. "A little war souvenir. I ain't actually got to use it on nobody yet, but hey, the war ain't over, right?" The colonel only stared unblinking as Curtis slowly lowered the knife toward the German's chest, holding the tip at the level of his heart. Then Curtis sneered, flicking the blade so it cut the binding that affixed the billfold chain to his jacket. He tossed the wallet over his shoulder to Walter, then slowly slid the dagger back into its sheath on his belt. Walter opened the billfold and thumbed through it, finding only the expected personal effects. There were photos of family, a few bills of currency, and a few pieces of paper with German writing, but no identification. Walter nodded to Curtis, who earned yet another glare of protest from the colonel when he reached down the back of his neck and pulled up the thin chain holding his oval dog tags. Curtis read them aloud, a bit smug. "Colonel Emil Dieter," he said, then turned to grin at his captive. Nice to meet you, Emil. Dieter scowled at the overfamiliarity from the enlisted man, but said nothing. The sound of shuffling boots made Walter glance back over his shoulder, and he found that the squad he had dispatched to clear the church was returning. One of the men, a young corporal named Jones, removed his helmet and took a deep drink of water from his canteen. "All clear, sir," he said between swallows. "Clear?" Walter asked, looking puzzled. That was obviously not the report he'd expected. "Yes, sir," Jones said, taking another long draw on his canteen. "The place is empty." Walter looked at him a moment, making sure he'd heard correctly, then turned back to the German officer. "You speak English, Colonel?" The colonel only stared ahead defiantly. Walter looked to Curtis, who translated the question. "Sprechen Sie English?" No answer. His patience thinning, Walter reached over, took the colonel's jaw in hand, and turned the man's head until their eyes met. Then he asked again, more firmly, "Where are the others?" Curtis attempted to translate, stammering and hesitating, as he stretched the limits of his ability with the language. Wo sind die anderen Männer? The colonel only remained silent, so Curtis started to repeat the question a little more loudly. Wo sind die... Stop, Dieter said, making no attempt to mask his disdain. Your German is terrible. Walter might have found this amusing had the situation not been so serious. Instead, he only asked again where the other two men were. Dieter looked at him, obviously trying to play dumb. Walter pressed. The two civilians your guys walked down the street. Where are they? Dieter only looked away, so Curtis picked up a broken splinter of wood off the floor and tossed it at him, bouncing it off the side of his head. You heard the man, Emil. Where are Laurel and Hardy? Dieter only ignored him, either not familiar with the American reference or simply unwilling to answer to such a lowly enlisted man. Walter sighed. What are you doing here, Colonel? I will not answer any questions, Dieter said, once again staring straight ahead. You will give me medical attention and take me to your superiors. Now! Walter raised an eyebrow, nonplussed. He gritted his teeth and drew a long, exasperated breath through his nose as he ran a dirty hand through his even dirtier hair. He caught the pungent stench of his own sweaty body odor and longed for a hot shower and a fresh set of clothes. Even a change of socks would have done his morale wonders. Instead, he was in the middle of a war, thousands of miles from home, and being talked down to by an arrogant Nazi ass. It showed remarkable restraint that Walter didn't smash his helmet into the man's face. But even if such actions weren't barred by the Geneva Convention, it just wasn't Walter's style. Look, Colonel, Walter said, as calmly as he could manage, I've been in a lot of churches, American, Italian, Irish, English, French, even a German church or two, and I can tell you right now, this one isn't right. Dieter looked at him coolly, as though balancing the fear of giving something away with genuine curiosity of what Walter had noticed. The candles, Walter explained, looking around. They've never been lit. No wax drippings on the floor. The pews aren't worn. Nobody's ever sat in them. The edges on the hymnals aren't frayed. Nobody's ever opened them. This place has never been used. He shrugged, then added, Not as a church, anyway. Dieter only stared at him blankly. A poker face, if Walter had ever seen one. So I'm going to ask you one last time. What is this place, and why are you here? The men waited in silence for an answer, until Curtis reached out and slapped the back of the colonel's head with his palm. "Hey, you stupid kraut! The man asked you a question!" "Go to hell!" Dieter shot back, then added what was meant to be an insult, "Yankee!" Curtis only laughed. "I'm a Dodgers fan, Emil." Walter sighed and rubbed his face. Obviously, the cordial route wasn't going to get them anywhere, so it was time to try another approach. He slowly stood up. "Go to hell, huh?" Walter said. "We've already been there, pal. We've been fighting you guys for 2 years, and quite frankly, I'm tired. The good news is the war is almost over. We won. As soon as Berlin falls, we'll all be on the trains headed home. Even you." He paused for dramatic effect. "The only question is where you'll be riding, the passenger car or the baggage car." Walter slowly turned around so that he was facing the other direction. Curtis took the cue and unsnapped his holster. He pulled out his prized Colt .45 pistol and pressed the large barrel to the colonel's temple. Then he cocked the hammer back, its metallic click loud and unmistakable. Apparently, the Geneva Convention didn't hold as much sway with Curtis. Dieter's eye began to twitch nervously, and he swallowed hard. "You cannot shoot a prisoner," he said, the slightest hint of a tremble in his voice. "And who would rat me out if I did?" asked Curtis coolly. "My commanding officer ain't looking, Jerry. All I have to do is say you attacked me, and boom! You're being buried with the rest of your men." Dieter considered this a moment, looking from Curtis to Walter and back. Then he yelled at Walter, defiant. "You only think you have won, Yankee. Berlin will never fall. Your presence in my country is a stain that will soon be wiped clean." Walter turned and looked down at him, mostly with contempt, but partly with pity. He had dealt with enough goose-stepping Germans to know this man would not bend or budge. He would remain loyal to the fatherland and would not give up at any cost. "I'm sorry you think so," Walter said. Then he nodded to Curtis and turned back around. The colonel's eyes widened in surprise. A sudden click made everyone jump, but it hadn't come from Curtis's gun. Instead, everyone quickly wheeled around to turn their weapons on the confessional a few feet away. As the wooden door slowly creaked open, a man's soft voice drifted out. "That will not be necessary, gentlemen." 2 hands slowly came into view to show they held no weapons. Still sitting on the floor, Colonel Dieter suddenly began to scream in rage. "Nein, du Verräter! Nein!" He started to get to his feet, but was quickly stopped when Curtis slammed the side of his pistol into the back of his head. Dieter fell forward and landed on his face, not quite knocked out, but definitely silenced as a trickle of blood slid down his neck. As the mystery man slowly emerged from the confessional, Walter immediately recognized him as being the tall, thin gentleman he'd seen earlier on the street. He stepped out completely, his hands still raised as he stared at the Americans, who looked back in surprise over their rifle sights. Walter shot Jones a glare, as if to ask why nobody had thought to check the space, and Jones quickly shook his head defensively. "I checked that, sir. I swear. He wasn't in there a few minutes ago." They all peered inside and were shocked to see a false door hidden in the back of the compartment. It stood open, revealing a small dark passage behind. Walter turned back to the man. "Who are you?" "My name is Professor Erich Seifert," the man replied, with an accent that Walter guessed to be Austrian. He gave a submissive nod before adding, "And you must be Walter Thomas." Walter was stunned at hearing the man say his name, especially since he hadn't yet given it. "How the hell did you know that?" Seifert only gave the faintest of smiles. "I have been waiting for you,"